Hello everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there today, but I'm looking forward to sharing this presentation with you, and I will see you again at another time. The title for our presentation today is Lively Pathways, Pedagogical Opportunities for Finding the Aesthetic in Everyday Practice. So artography is a way to invite practices of art making, living, knowing, teaching, researching, and learning as they augment one another. It considers what one creative practice might learn from another creative practice that is already underway. One assignment in my artography research course here at the University of British Columbia asks students to walk as usual in their everyday pathways. And as they're doing this, to notice something each week that they have not noticed before. They document their response visually as well as writing about it. The course assignment follows methodologically much the same structure as artography itself, in that artography is directed towards places where dynamic and relational practices move through each other, always emerging as something unpredetermined. Aligning well with new materialist thinking, artography emphasizes that whatever boundary-making practices we are engaged in to resolve ambiguity, they are not permanent nor separate, and each brings new potential.
Hello from Regina. I'm Valerie.
And I'm Michelle.
We're two university professors, and although we teach quite different courses from Rita and from each other, we've used the same assignment as Rita as a pedagogical methodology with our students. As we continue to talk together about the assignment, we realize that while much is gained in close attention and that a broader awareness of diversity is important, these are not the only things we wanted students to gain from this experience. We found that this assignment also provided a pedagogic space that interrupted habitual pathways, where students could respond to the aesthetic dimension of existence, where things are always affecting one another. We agree with philosopher Timothy Morton that whatever human art is, it is telling us something very deep about the structure of how things are. We are most interested in the implications of pedagogically engaging the aesthetic dimension that all art produces. This is a realm of existence in which one attunes to what is attuning to them. Practicing this embodied awareness has implications that might be helpful in further design of artographic pedagogy and research. And mobilizing our thinking, our practice, and analysis of this assignment are a post-humanist and new materialist awareness of a broader social, where humans are never in an exterior position with objective knowledge, but rather entangled in things not all present at once and never fully knowable.
Elizabeth Ellsworth describes embodiment as the root of learning, a non-linguistic event in which the simultaneous making of knowledge and self are participating outside the realm of knowledge already known. This event is a zone of connection, an organic extension of the body. This means that learning does not happen at the individual level. It happens as bodies of all kinds interact with themselves and others, including many different accompanying temporalities and affects. We usually think of causality as a connection between two events, such that one produces or brings about the other, where one is the cause and the other is the effect. But these interventions are also a kind of art or design. Morton claims that the zone of relation, where things affect both themselves and others, is the aesthetic. Morton argues for putting the aesthetic to work in designing and experiencing pedagogical experiences involving embodiment.
So we asked students to attend to this assignment by walking their regular pathways. Walking is our oldest act of creation and one that attunes bodies to cues of transition, preparing them for greater permeability and interpenetration with their surroundings. The idea that walking could be art is a test of the limits of art. This kind of art does not have to resemble things to bear significance, and it favors observation of the world in all its detail. Art becomes more complex in this understanding. It involves a more general history than that of representational art, and it connects more specifically to feelings of being of the world in its dynamic specificity, rather than of being specifically situated. So I'll begin by sharing the work of an undergraduate student named Jamie in her art education course. In her weekly practice, she looks for where things are suspended, uncertain. She describes this moment as one of waiting, not just herself waiting, but also the atmosphere and the place, suspended in between fog and mist, a moment, she writes, not defined by the past or the future, just there. Political theorist William Connolly writes about moments that might have some similarity to those that Jamie describes. He writes, there's a moment in which a bump or jolt of the world's gestational force jumps up from below the threshold of articulation and consciousness into the adventure of thought, desire, and action. It contributes a creative element, a moment not under the full control of those involved in it. Its agency and our agency become imperfectly fused. And all of this starts, he writes, at the threshold of the impossible. These are the moments that spur thinking as an encounter between a foregone past and a new situation, opening a possibility that may eventually belong to neither. In this moment she titles Liminality, Jamie encounters the threshold of the impossible, which is where pedagogy gets its power, not in its intentions, but from the undecidability between teaching address and response.
The learning self is an embodied self. Embodiment, defined as moving through places, does what all art does, which Simon O'Sullivan claims is to spark the aesthetic, an attuning function that involves accessing what is normally outside of oneself, the dimension of reality that is ambiguous, self-contradictory, illusory. This is not necessarily an opportunity for reflecting on things, as we often ask students to do, but rather for harnessing aesthetic forces in remaking oneself in alignment with the non-human interference being encountered. It's a pedagogic opportunity for repositioning and mutating. In the aesthetic realm, things influence and inspire one another, becoming entangled so that one cannot tell for sure what causes or effects are. These events are not limited to interactions only between humans. Morton offers a more radical understanding. Aesthetic events happen when a saw bites into a fresh piece of plywood, or when a worm oozes out of some wet soil. Everything is continually modulating and being modulated by other things. Accessing the aesthetic is a deep re-experiencing of the irreducibility of anything to our perceptions or its relations or uses. The aesthetic, according to Morton, is causality. On this level of radical interaction and change, learning involves noticing the simultaneously making of knowledge and self, and noticing that it is more than just humans that are affecting and being affected by the world.
As we discussed this assignment, we realized that what might be most significant were moments in which students felt somewhat suspended, or times in which they seemed to feel both presence and absence, where categories seemed less defined and more fragile, or where there was a sense of things moving through one another. We look for mention of some momentary sensation of rich indeterminacy, even if next writing went quickly to generalization of familiarity. Morton claims that artistic inspiration is the electromagnetic field of the aesthetic. He writes that it is time for society to take this granddaddy of aesthetic vehicles out for a spin. The aim of our assignment was to do just that, to put the aesthetic to work and have our students take it out for a walk.
I'll share some work from a student named Erin in my Education Core Studies course on schooling and sexual identities. Erin returned repeatedly to a tree at her family's home over the weeks of the course. In early entries, she writes of an awareness of interactivity, how rain gave the tree encouragement and nutrients necessary for its bloom, how the tree filtered the sunlight for plants below. She began to notice the tree's relationship with other trees, how it protected smaller trees from wind and harmful weather. In later weeks, she asked her father if the tree produced fruit. And even as she asked, she writes, she realized her participation in human need to categorize things in relation to what they can or cannot do. She began to engage her interactions with the tree to understand one of our class readings that critiqued how we pathologize individuals who are different or who stand out because of failure to comply with dominant society. Erin recounts her mother's response to the tree's inability to produce fruit as a shame and therefore a waste of a tree. She finds this analogous to when attractive males are gay and heterosexual women call it a shame because they are not available for straight women. Using new materialist thinking that she was introduced in class, Erin writes about the world not as human-centered, but as, using a quote from one of the readings in the course, as a web of forces, intensities, and encounters between human and non-human elements that produce specific, highly constrained manifestations of sexuality, but also continual challenges, fragmentations, and resistances.
Now let me share with you one of my experiences. Marzi is a graduate student who engaged in a process of repetitive walks in her new neighborhood. She set a proposition that involved going on walks with no predetermined destination to take photos of unfamiliar objects. After 30 minutes, she determined she would turn back again and revisit those same objects. With her husband accompanying her, they frequently were reminded of their home in Tehran and discussed why some of the unfamiliar objects they were encountering might not actually exist there. Some of the unfamiliar objects included pedestrian call buttons, or coin laundromats, and SkyTrain tracks, walk signals, and car share systems. Marzi writes that she began to feel a strange sense of attachment to these objects. Documenting and paying close attention to them offered her a newly formed sense of closeness to them. In attuning to the realm of the aesthetic, Morton claims that when we tune into the more than human world, real things happen. In attuning, we are affecting causality. We are establishing a link with at least one other actually existing entity. Marzi made postcards from her photos. On the back of each, she wrote a short note related to a certain object and sent it to herself in Tehran, that part of her that stayed and never moved. She writes that continuously going back and forth between places and moments gives her the feeling of being suspended between two utterly different worlds. In her reading of other immigrant experience, even if people move voluntarily, they still face the feeling of living in a distant and isolated place for quite a long time. Marzi considers her postcards and those portrayals of unremarkable things as a collection of the mundane. However, she writes that to herself in Iran, the very mundaneness is what breathes life into them. To her, they are the windows into a parallel universe, bits and pieces of an ordinary life in a distant place, bringing her closer and closer to the her that lives here in Vancouver. She writes that she keeps going back to her Tehran self because it is an acknowledgement of the existence of her other self, an admittance that while Marzi in Tehran held on to her home, Marzi in Vancouver held on to her too. The walking and art making provided a sense of simultaneity for Marzi. She began by asking, where is that turning point where the unfamiliar finally becomes familiar? But through her inquiry, she became most attentive to finding familiarity and unfamiliarity continually entangled. If causality is aesthetic, our understandings of learning selves must begin to include reality beyond the individual human learner. That realm in which there is inner evidence of something in me that's not quite me. We must also consider the causal event of learning as a set of relations that are aesthetic. Pedagogically, for us, this necessitates more experimentation with finding and putting the aesthetic to work through moving in responsive attunement in everyday practices. Thank you for giving your attention to our presentation today.